The glass shattered before anyone saw it coming. One moment it was in Alina's hand, a crystal champagne flute, cold and expensive, and the next it was on the marble floor of the Grand Velour Hotel ballroom, exploding into 100 glittering pieces at her feet. Every head in the room turned, the music stuttered, the laughter died, and Elena Vasquez did not flinch. She stood perfectly still in the center of that enormous room, in a dress that had cost her 3 months of careful saving, with champagne soaking into the hem and humiliation radiating from every corner of the space around her. Her husband, stood 6 feet away with his hand still extended from the shove he had just delivered. Not a violent shove, worse than that, a dismissive one, the kind a man gives when he has simply stopped caring whether anyone is watching. "You embarrass me," Marcus said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You always embarrass me." Elena said nothing. She stood there while the whispers started, while the women in their gowns leaned toward each other with their painted mouths moving, while the men looked away with the practiced discomfort of people witnessing something they did not want to be responsible for. She stood there while her husband straightened his jacket, smoothed his tie, and turned back to the woman beside him, young, polished, draped in a red dress that left nothing to the imagination. As if Elena had already ceased to exist. And then Elena Vasquez did something no one in that ballroom expected. She bent down, very slowly, very deliberately, and picked up the largest piece of broken glass from the floor. She set it carefully on the nearest table. She straightened her spine. She looked at her husband once, not with rage, not with tears, but with the quiet, absolute finality of someone closing a door forever, and she walked away. She did not run. She did not look back. She moved through the parting crowd with her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and the only sound was the soft click of her heels on the marble floor, and the room felt it, that particular silence that falls when a woman has just made a decision that will change everything. She did not know that someone was watching her from the far end of the ballroom. She did not know that the man standing near the tall arched windows, half hidden in shadow with a glass of aged whiskey held loosely in one hand, had not moved since the moment the glass shattered. She did not know that his dark eyes had tracked her entire journey, from the moment of the shove to the picking up of the glass to the long walk toward the exit, with an expression that no one in his organization had ever seen on his face before, something that looked, almost impossibly, like recognition. His name was Nikolai Dragasai, and he was not supposed to be feeling anything at all. The Grand Velour Hotel was one of those places that existed to make ordinary people feel small. It had been built at the turn of the century by a man who believed that beauty was a form of power, and in that belief he had been absolutely correct. The ceilings soared 40 feet above the ballroom floor, painted with classical scenes of gods and mortals in impossible colors. The chandeliers were genuine Murano glass, each one worth more than most people earned in a decade. The floors were white Carrara marble veined with gold, and they were always cold, no matter the season, as if the building itself refused to be warmed. Nikolai Dragasai had walked into rooms like this one all his life and felt nothing. He had been raised in a house that had similar ceilings and considerably more danger, and grandeur had long since stopped impressing him. He came tonight because Victor had asked him to, and Victor was one of perhaps 4 people on Earth whose requests Nikolai still honored. And so here he was standing near the windows watching the room the way he always watched rooms, cataloging exits and threats and the subtle configurations of power. He was 36 years old, and he looked like a man who had been carved rather than born. 6'2", shoulders that filled a custom jacket without effort, dark hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and considered silence. There was no softness in him that was visible. There was no warmth. People at parties like this one had been known to change the direction of their movement when they realized they were walking toward him, pulled by some instinct older than reason that said, "This man is dangerous." They were not wrong. What they didn't understand, what almost no one understood, was that Nikolai's danger had never been the chaotic kind. He had never been a man who raged. He had never raised his voice in anger in a room where raising his voice would have been appropriate. His power was something else entirely. It was the absolute certainty that whatever he decided, it would happen. No tantrum required, no performance necessary. He simply decided, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. This was why no one could explain, later, why he was still standing at those windows long after Elena Vasquez had disappeared through the ballroom doors. He had watched the whole thing. He had seen the husband soft-faced, prosperous in the way of men who inherit rather than earn, the kind of man who confused access with worth, deliver that dismissal with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times before. He had watched Elena absorb it. And what he had watched in her, that stillness, that refusal, that quiet and devastating decision to simply leave, had done something to him that he was not prepared to examine in the middle of a crowded ballroom. He set his glass down on the windowsill. "Find out who she is," he said quietly to the man standing 3 steps behind him. Always 3 steps behind, always present, always invisible unless needed. The man said nothing. He simply moved because that was what was required of him, and within 4 minutes he had returned with a name, a table number, and the basic outline of his story. Nikolai listened. He did not look away from the door she had walked through. When the man finished, Nikolai was quiet for a long moment. And the husband, Marcus Vasquez, commercial property developer, has accounts with 3 of the legitimate holding companies and one of the, I didn't ask about the accounts. A pause, precise and cold. I asked about the husband. Another silence. He left with the woman in the red dress 40 minutes ago. They took his car. Nikolai picked up his glass again. He looked at the door one more time. "Leave him," he said, "for now." Elena found the hotel garden by accident. She had been looking for the exit, the real exit, the one that led to the street, to a taxi, to the particular mercy of a closed door between herself and the rest of the world. And instead she had pushed open the wrong door and stumbled into a garden that had no business existing in the middle of the city. It was small and walled and lit by old iron lanterns, and there was a stone bench near a fountain that made the kind of soft, continuous sound that asked nothing of anyone. She sat down. She didn't cry. She had made a private rule for herself years ago about crying in places where anyone might find her, and she kept her rules even when no one was watching, because the keeping of them was point. So she sat very straight on the cold stone bench, and she breathed, and she let the sound of the fountain fill the space where her thoughts were trying to form, and she looked at her own hands in her lap and noticed that they were completely steady. That struck her, somehow, the steadiness. She had been married to Marcus Vasquez for 6 years. She had spent those 6 years making herself smaller in increments so small she had almost not noticed, until tonight, when she looked down at how small she had become and found she could no longer remember the woman she had been before, the woman who had opinions that filled rooms, the woman who laughed without checking first to see if it was appropriate. The woman her mother had raised, the woman her father had called fierce, the woman who had once, in another life that felt like it had happened to someone else, believed that she was worth something in any room she entered. Marcus had not taken that woman away. She was more honest than that. She had handed her over, piece by piece, in the 6-year-long negotiation of a marriage to a man who needed her diminished in order to feel large. And now she was sitting on a stone bench in a hotel garden at 11 o'clock at night, and her husband was somewhere across the city with a woman in a red dress, and Elena was thinking, with great clarity and very little emotion, that she was done. Not angry done, not hurt done, just done. She didn't hear the garden door open behind her. She didn't hear footsteps, which should have told her something about the man making them. She only knew someone was there when a shadow fell across the fountain's light, and she turned her head and found a man standing at the edge of the garden path, looking at her with dark eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. She did not recognize him. He was not the kind of man one forgot easily, so she would have remembered if she had seen him before. But he was a stranger, and he was large, and it was 11 o'clock at night in a semi-private garden, and Elena Vasquez, despite everything, despite the evening, despite the 6 years, did not look afraid. She looked at him the way she had looked at Marcus when she picked up the piece of broken glass. Steady, considering, present, this garden is private, she said. Her voice was calm. Most of the hotel is private, he said. That doesn't seem to stop anyone. His voice was low and even and faintly accented in a way she couldn't immediately place, and he hadn't moved from the edge of the path, which she noticed, and which she filed away as something that could mean courtesy or calculation, and she didn't yet know which. Did you follow me? She asked, a pause that lasted exactly one breath. I was looking for a different door. Elena looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the fountain. So was I, she said. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the path for another moment, and then, with the deliberate quality of a man who rarely did anything without reason, he moved to the other end of the bench, the far end, maximum available distance, and stood beside it, one hand resting on its back, not quite sitting, not quite leaving. Elena did not look at him. You were in the ballroom, he said. It was not a question. So were 200 other people. Most of them didn't walk out the way you did. She was quiet for a moment. The fountain continued its soft, indifferent work. How did I walk out? He considered the question. Like someone who had made up their mind. Elena turned her head and looked at him then, really looked, with that particular attention she had trained herself to suppress in recent years, the attention that noticed things. She noticed that his suit was not merely expensive but considered, chosen by someone with taste rather than money alone. She noticed that he held himself with a stillness that was different from her own stillness. Hers was hard, one practiced, built out of necessity. His was simply native, as though he had never needed to learn it. And she noticed his eyes, which were watching her with an attention so precise it should have been uncomfortable, and instead was, strangely, something else. It felt like being seen. She had forgotten what that felt like. You don't look like someone who wanders into the wrong garden, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but not nothing. Neither do you. The fountain ran. An ambulance moved somewhere on the street beyond the hotel wall, its siren brief and then gone. The iron lanterns cast their amber light across the stone, and Elena Vasquez sat on a bench in a garden with a man she did not know, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she did not need to perform anything at all. It was dangerous, that feeling. She knew it immediately. Comfort offered by a stranger in a dark garden was never simply comfort. She had been married long enough to know that the most threatening moments in life rarely announced themselves. But she was also 33 years old, and she had just been publicly discarded by the man who had promised to love her, and the fountain was soft, and this man, whoever he was, had given her the far end of the bench without being asked, and had not said he was sorry, and had not looked at her with pity. He had simply said, like someone who had made up their mind. And she had been so hungry for someone to see her clearly that she sat there and let herself be seen, and told herself she would be careful, and knew, in the part of herself that was always honest, that careful was already too late. She left the garden 20 minutes later. She did not ask his name, and he did not offer it. She stood up, and he stepped back without being asked again, that courtesy that might have been calculation, and she walked past him toward the garden door, and just before she pushed it open, she stopped and looked back at him once, over her shoulder. He was standing in the lantern light, with his hands in his pockets, watching her go. He looked like a man waiting for something, though what he was waiting for she couldn't have said. "Thank you," she said, "for not saying you were sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Sorry is for people who believe things could have gone differently. She pushed open the door and walked out into the hotel corridor, and she did not hear anything behind her, no footsteps, no voice, no sound. And when she finally stepped out onto the street and raised her hand for a taxi and felt the cold night air move against her face, she told herself very firmly that she would not think about him again. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about that in a way that would cost her everything. And somewhere in the garden, Nikolai Dragasai stood very still in the amber light and looked at the door she had walked through and reached up and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his sternum. A gesture so private, so involuntary, that he had not made it in years, as if something in his chest had just done something he hadn't given it permission to do. The next morning arrived the way bad mornings always do, quietly, without warning, with the specific cruelty of sunlight through curtains that were never meant to keep it out. Elena woke in the guest bedroom. She had moved herself there 3 months ago, one suitcase at a time, in the small hours of nights when Marcus was asleep or absent, until the migration was complete and the guest bedroom had become, by silent mutual agreement, simply her room. Marcus had said nothing about it. That said everything. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, and let the events of the previous night move through her in order: the ballroom, the glass, the walk, the garden, the man, and then she got up. Because lying still had never solved anything, and she had always known this about herself, the apartment was quiet. Marcus had not come home. She registered this the way you register weather, as information, not injury. She made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the city organize itself into another Tuesday. And she thought about what came next with the same methodical attention she gave everything. Because falling apart had never been something she allowed herself the luxury of doing before noon. There were practical things to consider. There had always been practical things to consider, which was perhaps why she had stayed 6 years when she should have left after 2. Because practicality had a way of disguising itself. Wisdom and Elena had always been too intelligent for her own peace of mind. The apartment was Marcus's. The car was leased in his name. Her salary as a translator for an international legal firm was enough. She had made sure of that quietly over the last year. The way a person instinctively begins preparing for a departure, haven't yet consciously decided to make. She realized, holding her coffee cup with both hands against her sternum. She lowered it, made a note of the gesture, let it mean what it meant. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at it without moving toward it. Marcus's name. She watched it buzz 3 times and go silent, and then she poured the rest of her coffee down the drain and went to get dressed, because she had a meeting in the city at 10 o'clock, and she had never once in her professional life been late for anything that mattered. What she did not know, as she moved through the quiet apartment gathering her things, was that 14 floors below her building's entrance, a black car had been parked since 7 that morning. And in that car, reading through a brief on his phone with the same focused attention he brought to everything, sat a man who was telling himself, with decreasing conviction, that his interest here was purely a matter of due diligence. Nikolai had looked into Marcus Vasquez that morning, not because he planned to do anything with the information. He told himself this, but because incomplete pictures bothered him, and last night had left him with an incomplete picture that had proven inconveniently resistant to being set aside. What he found had not surprised him. It had confirmed the shape of a thing he had already seen clearly in a ballroom. In the 6 seconds, it took a man to shove his wife's glass away and turn back to another woman. Marcus Vasquez was the kind of man who existed in the specific overlap between cowardice and cruelty. Not dangerous enough to fear, but small enough to do damage in the contained spaces where smallness went unchallenged. He had 3 properties in foreclosure proceedings that his business partners didn't know about. He had a second phone. He had a habit of being precisely the kind of man who believed that charm and the right address were a substitute for character. He also, Nikolai had discovered at 7:53 that morning, had a connection indirect, several steps removed, deliberately obscured, to a shipping operation that moved things that were not supposed to be moved through ports that Nikolai's organization had a specific and long-standing interest in. This, Nikolai told himself, was why the black car was parked outside Elena Vasquez's building. This was purely operational. This was surveillance on a person of tangential interest to an ongoing business concern, and had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with a woman sitting on a stone bench at 11 o'clock at night, refusing to perform her own devastation for an audience of one. He was a convincing liar. He had been lying to himself for 36 years and had gotten quite good at it. But even he noticed, at 8:20, when the building's front door opened and Elena walked out, navy coat, dark hair pulled back, the same straight spine she'd carried out of the ballroom, that his attention moved from his phone to the street with a speed that had nothing professional about it. She didn't look toward the car. She turned left on the pavement and walked at a pace that covered ground without appearing hurried, the walk of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had calculated the most efficient path to get there. She had a leather bag over one shoulder and earbuds in, and she was, from the outside, completely composed. Nikolai watched her until she turned the corner. Then he sat for another 30 seconds looking at the corner she turned around, and then he made 2 calls, the first to his second in command regarding the Vasquez shipping connection, which was entirely legitimate, and the second to a woman named Catalina who ran the most exclusive private members' dining room in the city, and who owed him a considerable favor, and who picked up on first ring. "I need a table for 2, he said, "tonight." A pause on the line for 2, Catalina said, and he could hear the surprise she was professional enough not to express fully. "You never bring anyone. I'm aware of my own habits. Tonight is tonight," he said. "Table by the window, 8 o'clock. He paused. "Please." The please landed in the silence between them like a stone in still water, because Nikolai Dragisai did not say please. He simply did not, as a rule, and the people who worked with him had long since stopped expecting it. "Of course," Catalina said quietly. 8 o'clock. He ended the call, looked again at the corner. Reached a decision he did not examine too closely. The way a man avoids looking directly at a bright light. Now he simply needed Elena Vasquez to agree to have dinner with him, and he had absolutely no conventional mechanism for making that happen, because the normal architecture of his life, the power, the fear, the web of obligation that made people say yes before he had finished the sentence, was not something he was willing to deploy here. Here, for reasons he was not yet ready to name, he wanted her to choose. It took him until noon to find the opening. It came through her firm, a legal translation document, a client with European holdings, a connection that was entirely legitimate and entirely manufacturable if you had the right accountant and the right set of subsidiary names. By 12:45, Elena Vasquez had received a professional request for an urgent in-person consultation from a new client represented by a name she wouldn't recognize. By 1:15, her assistant had confirmed the appointment. At 7:55 that evening, Elena walked into Catalina's and understood within 12 seconds that something was wrong with the shape of this evening. The restaurant was too quiet, too perfect, the lighting too considered. There was no other client. There was only a table by the window, and a man already sitting at it who looked up when she entered and watched her cross the room with those same dark eyes that gave nothing away. She stopped at the table, she looked at him, she said, very quietly, "You." And Nikolai Dragisai looked up at her from his chair and said nothing for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to be intentional. And then he said, "Sit down, Mrs. Vasquez. We have a great deal to discuss. You arranged this," she said. "Not a question. I did." She stopped. Something moved across her face, not fear, and not the flush of flattery, but something more complicated than either. Something that lived in the border territory between anger and interest. "That's an extraordinary thing to do. I've been told that before. I'm sure you have." She looked at the table, at the window, at the room. She looked at him. "About what, exactly?" "Your husband," he said, "and a matter of some business. Sit down." A pause, and then, again that word, that strange and rare word from a man who never used it. "Please." Elena sat down. She placed her bag on the chair beside her. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the complete, unguarded attention that had unnerved him in the garden. That quality of seeing that felt like being understood rather than assessed. "You know my name," she said. "Yes, I don't know yours." He looked at her for a moment. The candlelight moved between them. "Nikolai," he said. She turned the name over quietly, the way a translator does with any new word, feeling its weight, its texture, the shape it made in the air. "Just Nikolai." "For now," he said. "That's enough for now." The waiter arrived with water and menus, and the brief domestic interruption of the real world settled over the table. And Elena Vasquez looked at the menu without reading it and thought about what she was doing here, sitting across from a man who had manufactured her presence in a room and looked completely unapologetic about it, and who had said please in a way that suggested the word cost him something, and whose eyes hadn't moved from her face since she sat down. She thought about Marcus and the ballroom, about the guest bedroom, about the coffee she'd poured down the drain that morning, about the 6 years of herself she had quietly mislaid, and the spine she had found again last night on a cold stone bench. She put the menu down. "You said my husband," she said. "What about him?" And across the table, Nikolai set down his own menu with the particular care of a man who has just realized the conversation is about to become something he didn't plan for, and looked at Alina. Vasquez really looked, the way he had in the ballroom and in the garden, with that quality of attention he gave almost nothing in the world, and said, "He's involved in something he doesn't understand, and you may be in the middle of it without knowing." The candle between them dipped in a draft from somewhere. Alina did not look away. "Tell me," she said. And he did, or he began to. And what he began to tell her was enough, just enough to change the shape of everything that came after, and not nearly enough to prepare either of them for what they were walking into together. In a city that had no mercy for people who felt things they hadn't planned to feel, the dinner lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Alina would remember this later, the precise duration, because she had spent the first 20 minutes waiting for the moment when it would become what she expected it to be. She had been in enough rooms with powerful men to know the grammar of their attention. The way it arrived fully and then slowly, imperceptibly, became about them. The way being seen by such men always turned out, eventually, to be a means to something else. That moment didn't come. Nikolai spoke about Marcus's shipping connection with the flat, factual precision of someone delivering a briefing. No drama, no elaboration, no performance of concern. There were containers moving through the port of Constanta, with documentation that named 3 of Marcus's holding companies as beneficial owners. The documentation was false, Marcus, Nikolai believed, had signed without understanding what he was signing, which was its own kind of indictment, but the goods inside the containers were not. Something false documentation could make innocent. People were involved in sourcing those goods who did not tolerate loose ends. He's exposed himself, and Nikolai said, and by extension, you. Alina had listened to all of this without interrupting. She had the translator's discipline of receiving information completely before responding to it, and she used it now, letting the shape of what he was saying assemble itself fully before she spoke. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why not him?" A pause. "Because you're the one who will handle it correctly." She looked at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know what I watched last night," he said. "A woman who picks up broken glass from the floor and walks away without running. That is someone who handles things correctly." The silence after that was one of those silences that has texture, that you could reach into and find something real. Alina sat in it for a moment, and she was aware acutely, uncomfortably aware, that she was being offered something. Not safety, not rescue. He wasn't offering to fix this for her. He was offering information, and the particular respect of being given it directly. She had not been given information directly in 6 years. She had been managed, shielded, handled, or ignored. "What do you want in return?" she asked. He turned his glass slowly on the tablecloth, half a rotation. "Back again." "Nothing yet," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She should have pushed. Any sensible person would have pushed. But she found, sitting there in the candlelight with her hands still, and her breathing controlled and every trained instinct she had cataloging this man for threat, and finding something more complex than threat, that she believed him. Not because he had earned it, not because she was naive, but because there was something in his way of speaking, that absolute, undecorated directness, that her body recognized as true in the way bodies sometimes know things before minds catch up. She was careful with that recognition. She noted it. She filed it somewhere guarded. "I'll need documentation," she said. "If I'm going to do anything about Marcus's exposure, I'll need to see the actual. It will be at your office by 9 tomorrow morning." She stopped. He had already arranged it. He had arranged the documentation before she agreed to look at it, before she had even sat down at this table, and she could see it on his face, not arrogance, not the assumption of compliance, but something more unsettling, certainty, not that she would do as she was told. Certainty that she was exactly the kind of person who would see something clearly and act on it, and that he had been right about her, and that this was simply how things proceeded. "You were sure I'd want to see it," she said slowly. "Yes, that's a significant assumption." It wasn't an assumption. He looked at her steadily. "You walked out of that ballroom looking like someone who had decided something. I think what you decided was that you were finished accepting a version of your life that was smaller than you are. The documentation simply gives you a tool." Elena looked at him for a long, still moment. The restaurant hummed softly around them. Somewhere across the room, a couple laughed about something private, and the sound was brief and warm and then gone. "You watched me that closely," she said, from one evening. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. A fractional tightening, a breath held for just a half second too long. "You were difficult not to watch," he said. And there it was, the first crack. Barely visible, a hairline fracture and all that composure. But Elena saw it because she was paying attention, because she was always paying attention, and she felt the specific danger of it move through her like the first tremor before something larger. She picked up her wine glass and looked out at the dark city through the window beside them, because looking at him in that particular moment felt like something she needed a few seconds to survive. "I need to think about this," she said to the window, of course. He said, to his credit, to his very great credit, he said nothing else. They finished the evening talking about smaller things, her work, the peculiarities of legal translation, a city they had both been to in different years, and the conversation moved with the ease of two people who had known each other much longer than one dinner. And Elena catalogued that ease, and found it more alarming than anything else about the evening. When she left, he stood as she gathered her coat, a reflex of old manners, she suspected, old, whirled in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, and walked with her to the door, and outside, on the pavement in the cold night, ere he stopped beside her, while she pulled on her coat. And they stood for a moment in the amber glow of the restaurant's entrance. "The documentation will be there," he said, "at 9. "I heard you the first time," she said. "Yes," he said. "You hear everything." She looked at him one last time. He was watching her with that absolute, unreadable attention, and the cold air moved between them, and somewhere in the city a church bell struck 10, and Elena Vasquez thought quickly, dangerously, immediately suppressed that she could not remember the last time someone had looked at her like they were afraid of their own looking. She turned and walked to the waiting taxi. She did not look back. In her chest, something that had been very quiet for a very long time had begun, softly and without permission, to wake. The documentation arrived at 8:57. Elena was already at her desk when her assistant knocked and set down a sealed envelope with no return address, no courier company logo, nothing on its surface but her name written in a hand she didn't recognize, precise, economical, the handwriting of someone who wasted nothing, not even ink. She waited until her assistant left. Then she opened it. What was inside took her 40 minutes to read, and she read it 3 times, and by the end of the 3rd reading, she was sitting very still with her hands flat on the desk, and a feeling moving through her that was not quite fear, and not quite anger, but something that lived exactly between them. The feeling of a person who has just seen the full dimensions of a room they have been locked inside without knowing it. Marcus had signed 4 documents. She recognized 2 of the company names, holding structures she had heard him mention at dinner parties, casually, the way he mentioned everything financial, as proof of complexity rather than explanation of it. The other 2 names were new to her. Shell structures, layered inside shell structures, the kind of architecture that existed for one reason only, to make the thing at the center impossible to find. At the center was a logistics operation, containers, routes through 3 Eastern European ports, end destinations that were listed in the paperwork as agricultural goods, grain shipments, industrial equipment, the mundane vocabulary of international trade. She knew enough law. She translated enough contracts to understand what she was looking at. She also understood, with the cold clarity that had always been her sharpest tool, that Marcus had almost certainly not understood what he was signing. This was not exculpatory. Ignorance of a thing did not separate you from its consequences, and Marcus had spent 6 years telling anyone who would listen that he was a sophisticated businessman, and sophisticated businessmen did not sign documents without reading them. He had signed because someone had told him to, and because the fee had been generous, and because Marcus Vasquez had always believed that the rules of consequence applied to other people. She sat at her desk for a long time after that. Then she picked up her phone. She looked at the number she had saved under a single letter, N, and she told herself she was calling because she had professional questions about the documentation. She told herself this was procedural. She told herself she was in control of this. She pressed call. He picked up on the second ring and said nothing, and somehow the silence was a greeting. The shipping routes, she said. The end destinations listed as agricultural are their manifests. Yes. Can you get them? I already have them. Of course he did. She pressed her fingers briefly against her forehead. What's in the containers, Nikolai? I pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to tell her. The pause of someone deciding how. People, he said. The word landed in the office like something physical. Elena closed her eyes, opened them, looked at her desk, at the documents, at the ordinary surface of a Tuesday morning. Marcus doesn't know, she said. It was not a question, but she needed to say it out loud. No, Nikolai said. He signed for what he was told was a logistics subsidiary with favorable tax positioning. He was chosen specifically because he asks the right kind of questions, none. And the people who chose him are not people who tolerate complications. She understood what that meant. She understood it completely, in the pit of her stomach, in the place where abstract information becomes personal reality. Am I a complication? She asked. The pause this time was different, longer, weighted with something she could hear even through the phone. Not to me, he said. She sat with that for exactly 1 second before filing it away behind everything practical and urgent and requiring immediate attention. I need to see the manifests, she said, and I need to understand the timeline. How close is this to moving? The next shipment is in 11 days. 11. She exhaled slowly. And if it moves, then the documentation trail leads to Marcus. And from Marcus, in the logic of the people running this, it leads anywhere they need it to lead. She understood. She was the wife. She was the proximity. She was the person a certain kind of man points to when he needs somewhere to point. I want to meet, she said. Not a restaurant, somewhere I can work, tonight, he said. I'll send an address, fine. She paused. Something occurred to her. How did you know about the shipments, about Marcus specifically? The silence this time was careful. Because, he said, it is my port. Elena sat very still. Your port, she repeated. The operation moved through channels that belonged to my organization without my authorization. Someone used my infrastructure without my knowledge, which means someone believed they could. I don't allow that belief to persist. She was reorganizing everything she thought she understood about this situation. She was doing it quickly, because she was good at quick reorganization. But her hands on the desk had gone very still. Who are you? She said, not quite a question, almost a statement, the verbal equivalent of someone stepping back to look at a larger picture. Someone who has an interest in this being resolved, he said, and an interest in you not being caught in the resolution. Those are two different interests. Yes, he said. They are. The honesty of that stopped her completely. She had expected deflection, the smooth redirect of a man managing her perception. Instead, he had simply confirmed that yes, there were two separate interests operating simultaneously, and yes, he was aware of the distinction, and no, he was not going to pretend otherwise. She found, to her own disquiet, that she trusted the honesty more than she would have trusted reassurance. Tonight, she said again, send the address. She ended the call, set the phone down, looked out the window at the city, at the ordinary Tuesday moving past her office glass. At all the people below who were having normal days in which the word people did not arrive in a phone call. To describe cargo, she thought about Marcus, about what it meant that she felt in this moment more anger on behalf of strangers she had never met than grief for the marriage she was dismantling. About what that said about how much of the marriage had been real. She thought about Nikolai's voice when he said not to me. She picked up a pen and started making notes, because notes were what you made when the situation required action, and action was the only thing that stood between you and the part of your mind that wanted to sit very still and feel the full weight of everything at once. She was not ready for that part yet. The address he sent was in the old financial district, a building that looked, from the outside, like one of the unremarkable offices that filled that part of the city. No signage, a single door with a keypad, the kind of building that existed to not be noticed. Elena arrived at 7. She had changed from her work clothes into something that still read as professional but breathed better, which was a consideration she was making for practical reasons only. She pressed the buzzer. The door opened without anyone speaking into the intercom, which meant someone had been watching the entrance, which meant there was infrastructure here she was only beginning to understand. Edges of. Inside, a man she didn't recognize led her through a corridor and into a room that surprised her. She had expected something cold, functional, the aesthetic of power stripped to its essentials. Instead, the room was not warm, exactly, but considered. A large table with space to work. Actual books on shelves that looked read rather than decorative. A window looking over the city at night. A lamp that gave real light rather than the performative glow of rooms designed to intimidate. Nikolai was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came in, and she noticed cataloged, filed, that he had also changed, still immaculate, but different. A dark shirt instead of a jacket. Sleeves and this small detail landed in her chest like something she had not asked for, rolled to the forearm. He looked like a man who had been working. The manifests, she said, because beginning with business was the only safe beginning. He gestured to the table. She sat down. He sat across from her, not beside her, not at the head of the table, but across, which was a positioning she recognized as deliberate, and could not decide if it was a form of respect or a tactical choice or both. The manifests were worse than she'd anticipated. Not in volume, 3 shipments over 2 months, relatively contained, but in specificity. There were names. Partial names, initials, the bureaucratic remnants of human beings reduced to line items in a logistics document. And Elena read them with the steady attention of someone who was not going to look away from a thing simply because it was unbearable. Nikolai watched her read. He said nothing. He did not prompt her or summarize or soften. He simply let her encounter the documents on her own terms, which was, she was beginning to understand, characteristic of him. This absolute willingness to let a moment be what it was rather than managing it into something more comfortable. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at the table for a moment. Then she said quietly, "How many people know about these documents? In total, perhaps 8, in this room too. And the people responsible for the operation are currently unaware that I have this documentation. They believe they moved through my infrastructure undetected. How long have you known? 3 weeks. She looked up at him. You've been watching this for 3 weeks, she said, and you haven't moved. I was waiting. He said, to understand the full shape of it. You move before you understand the shape. You catch the edges and miss the center. She held his gaze. And now, do you understand the shape? Something moved in his expression, not quite the crack she'd seen before, but adjacent to it. A thoughtfulness that felt less like strategy and more like something private. Almost, he said. The word sat between them with more weight than it should have carried, and Elena felt it, and she was almost certain he knew she felt it, and neither of them addressed it, and the silence that followed was one of the loaded ones, the kind that contained an entire conversation, conducted entirely without words. She looked back down at the documents. I can translate the full manifests, she said. There are sections in Romanian that I don't think you have a clean rendering of. She tapped one page. This phrase here, it's not transferred goods. The correct translation is released from holding. That's a different stage of the operation entirely. That means there's a facility. Nikolai went very still. Say that again, he said, released from holding. There's a location before the port, a staging point. She looked at him. You didn't know that. No, he said, and his voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but more focused. The way a lens adjusts to bring something into sudden, sharp clarity. I didn't know that. He stood up, moved to the end of the table, looked at the page she was pointing to. He was close enough now that she was aware of him physically, the size of him, the particular quality of stillness he had even when he moved, the faint smell of something expensive and clean. She kept her attention on the document. The word is Holdier, she said, pointing. In this context, in a logistics document with this routing structure, it's a warehouse or a facility, a pre-transit holding point, probably within 2 hours of the port. There are 17 potential sites within that radius that we know about, he said, almost to himself. He straightened, moved back to his side of the table, picked up his phone, and sent a message with the rapid focus of someone who has just gained a piece of information that reorients an entire plan. You've just given me something significant, he said, setting the phone down. He looked at her with an expression that she had no existing category for gratitude, she thought, but not the performed kind. The real kind, the kind that surprised even the person feeling it. I translated a word, she said. You translated the right word, he said at the right moment. Elena looked at him for a moment. Is that what this was? She said carefully. Tonight was the rest of it, the restaurant, the documentation, was it to get me in a room to translate that phrase? The question landed squarely, and she watched him receive it without flinching. He was quiet for a moment that she felt acutely. No, he said. Then what was it? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. He looked at her across the table, and she looked back at him, and the city moved outside the window behind him, and the lamp made its warm circle of light, and neither of them moved. I don't know yet, he said at last, and I'm not accustomed to not knowing. The honesty of it hit her like cold water, clean and sharp and slightly breathtaking. She looked at this man who moved through the world with the certainty of someone who had decided everything in advance, and found him sitting in her gaze admitting that she was a thing he had not calculated, and she felt something shift in the careful architecture of her own defenses. She looked back at the documents. There's more to translate, she said. Yes, he said. They worked for 2 more hours. Side by side at the table eventually, necessity overriding the geometry of distance, her finger moving across phrases as she rendered them, and his pen noting each clarification with the focus attention of a man who wasted absolutely nothing he was given. She forgot, for stretches of time, to be careful. She forgot to measure the distance between them or monitor the quality of the silences or guard against the specific danger of this particular proximity. She forgot until they reached a passage near the end of the last document, a coded reference, clumsy and unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, that named a contact in the receiving city. She read it. She read it again. What is it? Nikolai said, because he was watching her face, and her face had done something she hadn't controlled. She looked up at him. The contact name, she said slowly, in the receiving city. Yes, it's a lawyer, she said. An international contract lawyer. She paused. Each word came out with the precise weight she was giving it. Who works at my firm? The room went completely silent. Not the meaningful kind of silence, the dangerous kind. The kind that means the shape of a thing has just changed entirely, and what you thought was a contained problem has just revealed that it was never contained, that it reached further than you saw, that it reached, in fact, directly into the life you thought you were standing outside of. Nikolai looked at her. She looked at the document. I go to that office every day, she said quietly. I sit 20 feet from that person every day. And in that moment, the careful distance she had maintained from the full weight of this situation simply ceased to hold, and she felt it, all of it, land on her at once, and her hands on the table were no longer steady, and she was very glad she was sitting down because she was not certain her legs would have held her. Nikolai did not speak immediately. He did not say it will be fine or you're safe or any of the reflexive reassurances that would have been, she recognized, a form of condescension. He simply turned his chair toward her, a small motion, but deliberate, and was present in the silence with her. And that presence was, somehow, the only thing she could have borne in that moment. Her hands were trembling. She looked at them with the detached curiosity of someone observing a reaction they hadn't ordered. And then she felt his hand, large, warm, completely still, settle over both of hers on the table. He didn't say anything. She didn't pull away. They sat in that silence for a long time in the lamplight in the room above the city, while outside the world continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that two people were sitting very still in the specific gravity of a thing that had become, without either of them deciding it, about much more than documents. She pulled her hands away first, not quickly, not with the sharp recoil of someone who had made a mistake, but slowly, deliberately, the way you close a window when the weather is turning. She moved her hands to her lap and looked at the document and breathed once, carefully. And when she looked up again, her face had reassembled itself into something composed. Nikolai moved his hand back to his side of the table. Neither of them mentioned it. The lawyer's name, he said. His voice was back to its operational register, flat, focused, stripped of everything that had been present 30 seconds ago. "Is it someone you know well enough?" she said. "We've worked on the same client files. We've had lunch." She paused. "I recommended him for a promotion 8 months ago." Something passed across Nikolai's face too quickly to read. "Does he know who you're married to?" "Everyone at the firm knows who I'm married to." A beat knew who I was married to. Nikolai looked at her carefully. "You need to behave normally at that office tomorrow. Nothing different, no confrontation, no distance, nothing that signals a change. I know how to behave normally," she said, and there was an edge in it, not directed at him precisely, but at the assumption, at the long history of men explaining to her how to handle herself in rooms. He received it without defense. "Yes," he said simply, "you do." The edge dissolved. She hated, slightly, how easily it dissolved. "What happens now?" she said. "I find the facility. I deal with the operation. The documentation trail, including the connection through your firm, gets neutralized in a way that doesn't require you to be present for any of it. And Marcus." The pause was brief but complete. "Marcus will be removed from the trail," he said. "He'll face the consequences of his own financial arrangements separately, through channels that have nothing to do with this." She understood what that meant and what it didn't mean. "You're protecting him." "I'm removing a complication," he said. "Whether Marcus experiences that as protection is his own concern. He doesn't deserve protection." "No," Nikolai agreed. "He doesn't, but you deserve for this to be clean." She sat with that. Outside, a siren crossed the city and faded. "Why?" she said at last. "Why does it matter to you whether it's clean for me?" He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made the light soft and the shadows long, and he looked in that moment less like the architecture of a man who had decided everything in advance and more like someone standing at the edge of something he had not mapped. "I watched a woman pick up broken glass from a ballroom floor," he said, "and walk out of a room that had just tried to reduce her to nothing. And she didn't run, and she didn't cry, and she didn't perform her own survival for the audience that had caused her harm. And I thought," he stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. "I thought that was someone the world owed a cleaner story." Alina looked at him for a long time. "That's not a professional reason," she said softly. "No," he said, "it isn't." She went home to an apartment that felt different in the dark. She moved through its rooms with the lights low, not quite ready for the full fluorescent honesty of overhead illumination. And she sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, her room, and looked at the window and let herself, carefully and with great control, feel the full surface area of the day. The documents, the manifests, the names on the pages, the lawyer 20 feet from her desk. Marcus's signature on 4 pages he hadn't read. Nikolai's hand over hers, warm and still, offered without explanation or expectation. She lay back on the bed without changing her clothes and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the woman she had been before Marcus, the one who had opinions that filled rooms. and she tried to remember the last time she had made a decision that was purely her own. Not reactive, not compensatory, not structured around the management of someone else's comfort or ego or need. A decision that came from the center of herself, from whatever was still intact down there beneath 6 years of careful diminishment. She thought about Nikolai saying the world owed her a cleaner story. She thought about the fact that no one, not in 6 years, possibly longer, had looked at her and seen someone the world owed anything to. They had seen a wife, a professional, a competent, composed, manageable woman who could be relied upon to handle things without making a scene. No one had watched her walk out of a ballroom and thought, that person deserves better than this. She closed her eyes. She was not going to cry. She had her rule. But she lay very still on the bed in the dark and felt the specific pressure of being seen by someone after a long time of being invisible, and it was not comfortable. It was, in fact, one of the most destabilizing things she had felt in years, because comfort she could have resisted, and pity she could have dismissed, but being seen, being accurately and specifically seen, by someone who wanted nothing from the seeing except the seeing itself, she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Breathed, kept the rule. She went to work the next morning and sat 20 feet from a man named Daniel Petter and spoke to him about a client file regarding an infrastructure project in Lyon and watched his face while he talked and saw, or believed she saw, nothing. He was 30, one and pleasant, and had a photograph of a dog on his desk, and he made coffee for the whole office on Fridays, and Alina sat across from him in a meeting room and translated a contract clause from French into English, and felt the strange, dissociating unreality of a world that did not know what it contained. She texted Nikolai once, from the bathroom, a single line, nothing visible. He's normal. The reply came in under a minute. I know. We're watching the building. She stared at the message. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to her desk and spent the afternoon being extremely professional. At 4:15, Marcus called. She looked at his name on the screen. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the manifests with his signature. She thought about 6 years of herself handed over in increments. She answered, Alina. His voice had the particular texture it got when he needed something smooth on the surface, slightly pressurized underneath. We need to talk. Yes, she said. We do. Tonight. Dinner. There are things I want to explain. A pause. About the other night, she said. I'd had too much to drink and the Harrington deal was falling apart and I took it out on you and that wasn't. He stopped. She could hear him choosing words with the care of a man who had done this before. Come to dinner. Let me fix this. Alina looked out her office window at the city. She thought about what Nikolai had said. Behave normally. Nothing different. Nothing that signals a change. She thought about 11 days. Fine, she said. Dinner. She could hear the relief in his exhale, the relief of a man who believed that access was the same as absolution. 8 o'clock, he said. Rosario's. I'll book our table. 8 o'clock, she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment with her phone in her hand, and then she opened a new message to Nikolai. Marcus wants dinner tonight. He's going to try to repair things. The reply came quickly. Go. Let him talk. Don't react to anything. Listen only. She looked at the message for a moment. Something shifted uncomfortably in her chest, not jealousy, not fear, but something in the territory of both. She was taking instructions from a man she had met twice, in exchange for protection from a situation she hadn't chosen, while going to dinner with a husband she had already left in every way that mattered. She thought about autonomy, about the woman who made her own decisions, about the version of herself she was trying to recover. Then she thought about the names in the manifests, the people in the containers, the staging facility somewhere within 2 hours of a port. She typed back, I know how to listen. His reply was a single word, yes. Then, after a pause that felt deliberate, be careful with him tonight. He doesn't know what he's sitting in the middle of. That makes him unpredictable. She read it twice. Then she put her phone away and went back to work, and did not examine why the word careful, coming from him, felt different than it had ever felt coming from anyone else. Rosario's was a restaurant that Marcus considered romantic and Alina considered performative. It had candles and low music, and a sommelier who recognized Marcus by name and made a point of demonstrating this. And Marcus had always loved it for exactly that reason. She arrived precisely at 8 and found him already at the table, which was unusual. Marcus was constitutionally late. It was one of the small power games he played so habitually she doubted he was conscious of it anymore, and the fact of his earliness told her he was genuinely unsettled. She noted it. She sat down, he looked at her, she looked at him, and here was a thing that happened in that restaurant that she had not anticipated. She saw him clearly. Not the Marcus of her grievances, not the Marcus of the ballroom, not even the Marcus of the signed documents, just Marcus, as he actually was. 41 years old, soft around the eyes in a way that spoke less of cruelty than of a kind of permanent, low-grade anxiety. A man who had learned early that performance was safer than presence, and had never unlearned it. A man who was, at this particular moment, frightened of something he couldn't name. She felt no tenderness toward him, but she felt something quieter, the specific, exhausted compassion of a person who has stopped being angry because anger requires a form of hope, and hope was a thing she had finished spending on. "Marcus Vasquez, you look well," he said. "Thank you. I mean it. You look different. Something's different." She picked up the menu. "You said you wanted to explain." He talked for 20 minutes. She let him. He talked about the Harrington deal, a development project that had been unraveling for months, and about pressure and stress, and a moment of weakness, and a woman who meant nothing. Elena, she means absolutely nothing. He talked with the practiced cadence of a man who had rehearsed, and she sat across from him and listened with the patient attention she brought to everything and watched his face and thought. He believes this. He genuinely believes that explaining is the same as repairing. "Marcus," she said when he finally stopped. "Yes," he leaned forward. "Did you review the documents for the Constanta Logistics subsidiary before you signed them?" Complete silence. It was immediate and total, the silence of a man who has just heard something from a completely unexpected direction, and whose entire prepared speech has become instantly irrelevant. "What?" he said. "The holding companies, the 4 documents you signed in November." She kept her voice level and pleasant, the voice she used when translating in depositions, factual, uninflected, precise. "Did you read them before you signed? How do you—" He stopped. "Where did you hear about that? Did you read them, Marcus?" His face had undergone a rapid series of changes, surprise, calculation, the beginning of a deflection, and then it settled into something she had not seen before. Something that looked beneath all the performance like genuine fear. It was a tax positioning arrangement. He said, "Victor Solano brought it to me. It was straightforward. Victor Solano." She kept her face completely still. "He's a logistics consultant. He's been—" Marcus stopped again. He looked at her across the table, and she could see the moment he decided to manage this, the almost visible shift into the mode he defaulted to when cornered, which was the controlled release of partial truth designed to look like full disclosure. "Look, Elena, there may have been some irregularities in how the arrangement was structured. I'm looking into it. I have a lawyer." "You should get a better one," she said. He stared at her. She picked up her wine glass, set it down without drinking, looked at her husband, soon to be her former husband, across a table in a restaurant he considered romantic, and thought about 11 days, and facilities within 2 hours of a port, and names on manifests, and the word released from holding. "I want a divorce," she said. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours by the end of the week." The color left Marcus's face. "Elena, I'm not angry," she said, and meant it. "I don't need you to understand. I just need you to know. This is, you can't just." He reached across the table, and she looked at his hand on her wrist, and he felt something in her stillness and withdrew it. "Elena, what's happening? Something is happening with you that I don't understand." "I know," she said. "You haven't understood me for a long time. That's all right. You don't need to." She placed her napkin on the table. She gathered her coat. She stood. And Marcus Vasquez, sitting in a restaurant he had chosen to perform his remorse in, looked up at his wife standing over him and saw, for perhaps the first time with complete clarity, that she was leaving him, Not the performance of leaving, not the threat of leaving. The actual departure of a person who has been packed and ready for longer than he knew, and is simply, at last, walking out the door. "Wait," he said. "Alina, wait, the business thing, whatever you've heard. It's more complicated than." He lowered his voice. "There are people involved that you don't want to be near. If you're somehow connected to information about that arrangement, you need to be careful. These are not, I know who they are," she said quietly. His mouth closed. She looked at him one last time. "Get a better lawyer, Marcus, and answer your phone when the Solano people call. Don't let it go to voicemail. People like that interpret voicemail as an answer." She walked out of Rosario's into the cold night air and stood on the pavement and breathed and felt not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular sensation of a long and heavy thing being set down. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. "Nikolai, where are you?" She looked at the message for a moment. Then she looked up at the street and the cold dark and the ordinary city moving around her, and she typed, "Outside Rosario's." "It's done. 3 seconds. Nikolai, I know. I'm across the street." She looked up. Across the 4 lanes of evening traffic, parked against the opposite pavement, was a black car. She couldn't see through the tinted glass, but she felt it, felt the specific quality of attention coming from inside it. The attention she was beginning to recognize the texture of, the attention that had found her in a ballroom and followed her into a garden and sat across a table from her in lamplight and covered her hands with one warm, still, utterly undemanding hand. She stood on the pavement and looked at the car and felt something move through her that she could not and would not name in the middle of a public street. Then she typed, "You were watching." His reply was immediate. "I told you he was unpredictable." She almost smiled. "Almost," she typed. "I had it handled." His reply took slightly longer this time. "Nikolai, I know. I was watching to make sure, not because I doubted you." She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked at the car one more time and turned and walked toward the taxi rank at the corner, and did not let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that man had sat across a dark street in the cold specifically to make sure she was safe, and had told her immediately that he was there, and had not once suggested she needed rescuing. Behind her, across the street, the black car didn't move for another 2 minutes, and inside it, Nikolai Dragosai sat in the dark and watched Elena Vasquez walk away and felt, in the exact center of his chest, something that he had not felt in so long that he had genuinely believed it had been removed, the way a surgeon removed something dangerous years ago, in a room he never spoke about in the worst year of his life. He felt afraid, not of the operation, not of the people who had moved through his infrastructure without permission, not of the 11 days or the facility, or the complicated geometry of what came next. Afraid of this. Of her. Of the specific and irreversible way she had moved into his field of attention and refused to leave it, and the growing, undeniable certainty that he had been watching her across a street, not because the operation required it, but because the idea of her being in a room with Marcus Vasquez, and whatever fear Marcus was carrying had been, for the past 2 hours, the only thing in the world he could think about. He pressed his hand flat against his sternum. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his second in command and said in a voice that gave nothing away, "We move in 7 days, not 11. Get me the facility location by morning." And underneath the operational certainty, underneath all of it, the fear sat quietly in his chest and did not leave. It did not feel, he thought, entirely like a bad thing. The facility was found on the 4th day. It came through a source in the Port Authority, a man who owed Nikolai a debt that predated the current operation by several years, the kind of debt that accumulates interest not in money but in information. The location was a converted cold storage warehouse 40 minutes outside the city, registered to a company that didn't exist at an address that was a field. Nikolai received the coordinates at 5 in the morning. He was already awake. He had been awake since 3, which was unusual. He slept the way he did everything, with discipline and intention, and he had spent the 2 insomniac hours before dawn sitting at the window His apartment with a glass of water he didn't drink, thinking about things he had no productive framework for thinking about. He looked at the coordinates. He made 4 calls. He sent 2 messages. He put the operation in motion with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. And then he sat back down at the window and looked at the city coming slowly to light and thought about Elena. She had texted him the previous evening a professional message, clear and brief, confirming that Daniel Petter had left the office at his usual time and shown no signs of altered behavior. Attached was a translated section of the manifests she had completed at home. 3 pages of precise, annotated work that had clarified 2 operational details his own team had misread. He had read it 3 times, not for the information, though the information was valuable, for the quality of it. The way she moved through language like someone who understood that words were not decorative, that the difference between one word and another was the difference between a door and a wall, between released from holding and transferred goods, between a facility no one knew existed and a clean operation with no loose ends. He had written back, "This is excellent work." Her reply had come 40 minutes later, which meant she had been asleep and her phone had woken her, which meant she had not turned it to silent, which meant she was keeping it close. She had written, "I know." He had sat with those 2 words for longer than was reasonable. He was sitting with them still, here at 5 in the morning, with the city going gray. Blue outside the window and the coordinates of the facility on his phone, and 7 days, reduced now to 3. Because moving faster was safer for everyone, and Nikolai had always believed in doing difficult things quickly once the decision was made. He had a problem. He was aware of it with the same clear-eyed precision he brought to operational problems, which was perhaps the only framework he currently had available. The problem was this: Elena Vasquez was inside the perimeter of danger for as long as Daniel Petter sat 20 feet from her desk, and the cleanest way to resolve that was to move on the facility and the operation simultaneously, which he was doing, but the gap between now and resolution was 3 days, and 3 days was long enough for things to go wrong in ways he couldn't predict. And the thing he couldn't predict that concerned him most was not Marcus, and it was not Petter, and it was not the people running the operation through his port. It was her. It was the thing he had seen in her face at the restaurant table when she read the manifests, that brief, unguarded moment when the weight of it landed on her all at once, and her hands had trembled, and the thing he had felt when he put his hand over hers, which was not the controlled, calculated gesture of a man managing a situation, but something else entirely. Something that had come from a place in him that he had closed off so long ago. He had genuinely believed the door was gone. He was not a man who acted on feeling. He was a man who had survived by operating on clarity, on the understanding that feeling was weather. It arrived, it moved through, it passed, and that decisions made inside weather were structurally unsound. He understood all of this. He picked up his phone and called her anyway. It rang 4 times. She answered on the 5th, and her voice had the texture of someone who had been awake for a while, clear, but quieter than her daytime voice, stripped of its professional register, just her. "It's 5 in the morning," she said. "I know. Is something wrong?" "No, we have the facility location." A brief silence. "That's good. That's good news." Yes, silence. The particular silence of 2 people on a phone call at 5 in the morning who both know that the news, while real, is not why the call was made. "Nikolai," she said. "Yes. Why are you calling?" He looked at the window, at the city going light, at the glass of water he still hadn't touched. "I wanted to know you were all right," he said. The silence that followed was longer than the others. He sat in it without moving and listened to her breathe once, twice, and heard in that breathing the same quality of careful composition he recognized from the first night, the quality of a woman who was very precise about what she allowed herself to feel in front of other people, even on the phone, even at 5 in the morning. "I'm all right," she said. "You don't have to perform that for me," he said quietly. Another silence. "I know," she said at last, and her voice was different this time, softer at the edges, the professional composure not gone but stepped back, like a curtain pulled slightly to one side. "I keep thinking about the names on the manifests. She stopped. "Yes," he said, not a response. Just yes, I know, I'm here. I keep thinking that they're somewhere right now, she said. In that facility you just found, and they don't know anyone is coming. He closed his eyes briefly. 3 days, he said. We move in 3 days. Okay. A breath. Okay. Alina. Yes. After this is done. He paused. He was not a man who said things without having decided to say them, and he had decided this, somewhere in the 2 insomniac hours before dawn. I want to see you, not for the operation, not for the documents. I want to see you. The silence this time had a different quality entirely. It was not the loaded silence of concealed meaning or managed emotion. It was the silence of someone receiving something they had not let themselves expect. That's a significant thing to say, she said softly. Yes, you barely know me. I know, he said. I'm aware of that. I'm saying it anyway. Why? He thought about it. He thought about the ballroom and the garden and the restaurant and the black car across the street and the 5 in the morning insomnia and the 2 words, I know, sitting in his chest like something lodged, because I have spent a considerable number of years being very certain about everything. He said, and you are the first thing in a long time that I am uncertain about. And I find that I don't want to resolve the uncertainty. I want to, he stopped. This was as close as he had come in years to the actual interior of himself, the real room, the one with no performance in it. He was aware of the exposure of it, and he stayed in it anyway. I want to know you properly, whatever that takes. Silence. Then, very quietly, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who wanted something specific from me, information or leverage or, she paused, something I could identify and defend against. And instead, she said slowly, I have a man calling me at 5 in the morning to make sure I'm all right, who covered my hands with his and then said nothing about it, who arranged a dinner and admitted he didn't know why, who told me the world owed me a cleaner story. A pause that is considerably harder to defend against. I know, he said. I'm sorry. No, you're not. No, he agreed, I'm not. And she laughed, briefly, softly, barely a sound at all, but real, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has been caught telling the truth and found it unexpectedly survivable, and the sound of it moved through him like light through a cracked door, illuminating a room he had kept dark for so long he had forgotten what was inside it. He sat at the window with his untouched glass of water and listened to her laugh and felt the full, unguarded weight of wanting something he hadn't planned to want, and he did not suppress it, and he did not manage it, and he did not remind himself about whether. He let it be what it was. 3 days, she said at last when the quiet had settled back. 3 days, he confirmed, and then we see. All right, she said, and then, after a pause so small it was almost not there, I'm glad you called. He looked at the city, fully light now, fully itself. So am I, he said. The next 2 days moved with the strange doubled quality of time that is simultaneously too fast and too slow, the operation tightening toward its resolution, while Alina moved through her ordinary life with the particular tension of a person who knows that the surface of things is entirely disconnected from what is moving beneath them. She went to work, she translated contracts. She spoke to Daniel Petter about a filing deadline and watched his ordinary face and thought about the manifests and kept her expression professionally pleasant. She called her lawyer, a woman named Sophia who had handled Elena's affairs quietly for 2 years, as if she too had understood that a departure was coming long before Alina had said it aloud, and began the formal process of the divorce. She did not tell Marcus she had started the process. She did not need to. The conversation at Rosario's had been its own finality, and Marcus had the particular self-protective intelligence of a man who knows when a door has closed even if he cannot bring himself to stop knocking. He texted twice. She replied with brief, neutral messages that acknowledged without engaging. She was not cruel about it. She was simply done. At night, she worked on the remaining translation documents that Nikolai's team sent her in encrypted files, and she did this with a focus that was both professional and, she recognized, something else, a need to be useful, to be part of the resolution, to do something concrete for the names on those manifests rather than simply waiting for others to act. She was not, She had never been a person who waited well. On the second night, near midnight, a new file came through. She opened it and found not a translation request but a floor plan, the facility Han. Rendered and annotated in a shorthand she didn't fully recognize. Below it, a message from Nikolai, "Tomorrow night, I wanted you to know." She looked at the floor plan for a long time. She thought about the cold storage building 40 minutes outside the city. She thought about the people inside it. She thought about Nikolai moving through that building with the particular focused certainty of a man who had decided something and would see it through regardless of what stood in his way. And she felt a fear that was entirely new to her, not fear for herself, but the specific, destabilizing fear of caring what happened to someone specific. She typed, "Be careful." His reply came after a pause that she spent not breathing. "Nikolai, always, then, get some sleep, Elena." She put the phone down. She lay in the dark in the guest room that was her room and looked at the ceiling and thought about how quickly the geometry of a life could change. How 11 days ago she had been standing in a ballroom holding a champagne glass, and the most pressing crisis in her life had been the slow-motion collapse of a marriage she had long since left in spirit. And now she was lying awake at midnight, worrying about a man she had known for less than 2 weeks, who was going to walk into a facility tomorrow night and take apart something that should never have been built. She thought about what he had said on the phone. "I want to know you properly, whatever that takes." She had spent 2 days turning those words over with the careful attention she gave to language, testing their weight, their construction, the specific meaning of whatever that takes. She had been lied to with beautiful language before. Marcus had been, in the early years, quite good with words. But Marcus's words had always been about Marcus. They had been performances directed outward, designed to produce a specific effect in the person receiving them. Nikolai's words were different. They were, she searched for the right term, because she was someone who needed the right term, they were load-bearing. They held something real. They were the words of a man who said less than most people, and therefore said nothing he didn't mean. She was not naive enough to think that meant safety. She was not naive enough to think that a man who ran what Nikolai ran was a man whose world she could enter without cost. She had enough intelligence and enough honesty to look at what she knew about him, the port, the organization, the infrastructure, the particular kind of power that made everyone step back when he walked toward them, and understand that whatever that takes meant. It did not mean simple. But she was also 33 years old, and she had just spent 6 years in a version of her life that was smaller than she was, and she was done with small, and she was done with safe, and she was done with the particular loneliness of being managed rather than known. She closed her eyes. She slept. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. She was awake before the first ring finished. Some part of her had been waiting, had not fully released into sleep at all, and she had the phone in her hand before she was consciously aware of it. Reaching for it, the number was not Nikolai's. It was a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it anyway, because at 4:17 in the morning, in the context of the last 11 days, there was no version of not answering. "Mrs. Vasquez." A man's voice, accented, flat. "Yes. My name is not important. What is important is that you understand the situation you are currently in." A pause, precisely calibrated. "Your husband signed documents. Those documents created a connection. You have been asking questions about that connection, through channels you believe are private." She sat up. Her heart was beating with a steadiness that surprised her, not calm, but controlled, the same quality she had when she walked out of the ballroom. "Who are you?" she said. "The people who find loose ends inconvenient." The voice said, "Your husband is a loose end. You are beginning to look like one also. What do you want?" "We want you to understand that the man you have been meeting with is not what he appears. He is using your access to your firm, to your colleague, to certain information for his own purposes. He is finished with what he needs. You will be the person whose name is attached to the documents. You will be the loose end he leaves behind." Silence on the line. Deliberate, given space to land. She sat in the dark and listened to it, and thought with great precision and speed. "You're trying to separate me from him," she said, You're trying to make me pull back before tomorrow night. A beat. The briefest recalibration on the other end of the line. Mrs. Vasquez, you found out about the facility. You know he's moving tomorrow. You need him to not have whatever I've been providing. Her voice was level and clear and completely without tremor. This is a very standard approach. Divide and isolate. A longer pause. You are more capable than we anticipated, the voice said, and there was something in his tone that was neither compliment nor threat, but sat precisely between them. Yes, she said, I am, and she ended the call. She sat in the dark for 30 seconds. Then she called Nikolai. He answered immediately. He had been awake. Someone just called me, she said. A man, no name. He tried to tell me you were using me as a document trail to leave behind. Nikolai was silent for a moment. She heard him move, a door, footsteps, the shift of someone going operational. Are you at home? He said. Yes, stay there. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm sending someone to your building in the next 10 minutes. A pause, and then, and this was the thing that she felt move through her like a physical force. His voice dropped out of its operational register, entirely for exactly one sentence. Elena, are you frightened? She breathed. No, she said. You're allowed to be. She closed her eyes. I know, she said, but I'm not. A silence, brief and heavy. Good, he said, and the word carried more than it said, the way his words always did. I'll be there in 20 minutes. You don't have to, Elena. And the way he said her name, not sharp, not commanding, just completely certain. A man saying the name of someone who has become specific and irreplaceable in the geography of his attention. Stopped her completely. 20 minutes, she said. He arrived in 18. She heard the knock 3 times, the pattern he had evidently told his man to use so she would know, and she opened the door, and he was standing in the corridor in dark clothes with the focused stillness of someone who had already moved fully into operational mode, and he looked at her face in the doorway and something in his expression. That controlled, immovable face did something she had not seen before. It broke open, just slightly, just enough. He stepped forward and she did not step back, and the door was still open behind her, and the corridor was empty, and he looked at her. Really looked the full, unguarded version of the looking she had felt from across a ballroom and across a garden and across a table, and lifted his hand and pressed it briefly against her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, his palm against her jaw, barely touching, the most careful and the most devastating thing she had felt in longer than she could clearly remember. She covered his hand with hers. They stood in the doorway in the 4 o'clock dark, and neither of them said anything at all. Because some things are too real for words, and both of them knew it, and both of them, for once, let it be exactly that real. He stayed until 6. Not inside the apartment she had not asked him in, and he had not presumed, which was, she thought, entirely characteristic, but in the corridor outside her door, speaking quietly with the man he had posted at the building entrance, and then sitting on the single chair in the small lobby area at the end of the hall, while she sat on the other side of her closed door with her back against it. And they talked through the door for an hour in the dark, low voices, the way people talk when the world is asleep, and the usual rules of distance don't apply. He told her about the plan for that night. Not all of it, not the parts that were his alone to carry, but enough. The facility, the timing, the 2 teams. The documentation that would go simultaneously to 3 separate authorities in a way that could not be suppressed or redirected. A structure he had built specifically because he did not trust individual institutions, but believed in the redundancy of simultaneous exposure. She listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them about the people in the facility, how they would be moved, where they would go, who had been contacted about receiving them. He answered all 3 in full. You've been planning the after, she said. The after is the point, he said. Anyone can break a thing. The difficulty is what you build in the space where it was. She sat with that for a moment, her back against the door, her knees drawn up, the apartment behind her quiet. You're not what people think you are, she said, a pause on the other side of the door. She could feel him, the specific density of his presence. the way the air in a space organized itself differently when he was in it. "I am exactly what people think I am," he said. "I just have reasons they don't know about. Tell me one." Silence. "The long kind. There was a woman," he said at last, "years ago. She was in a situation not unlike the one you translated in those manifests. She didn't get out." A pause so still she held her breath. "She was someone I was responsible for protecting. I was 22, and I didn't understand yet what my name meant in the world, and by the time I understood it was too late to use it for her." Elena closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've been paying that debt ever since." He said, "Every port, every operation, he stopped. "It doesn't balance, it will never balance, but I keep paying." She pressed her hand flat against the door between them. On the other side, after a moment, she heard him do the same, the soft sound of a palm against wood. And they sat on opposite sides of a closed door in the 4 o'clock dark with their hands pressed to the same surface and said nothing at all, and it was the most intimate thing she had experienced in years. Perhaps ever. At 6 o'clock he stood. She heard him. "I need to go," he said. "The team briefs at 7. "I know, Elena." A pause. "What I said, on the phone, about wanting to see you after." "Yes. That stands. Whatever happens tonight, that stands," she breathed. "I know," she said. "Go." She listened to his footsteps move down the corridor. She listened to the elevator. She listened to the building settle back into its ordinary silence around her, and she sat on the floor with her back against the door, and her hand still pressed flat against the wood, and she let herself, for the first time in full, without management or control or the careful rationing of feeling she had practiced for years, she let herself feel it. All of it, the fear, the tenderness, the terrifying specificity of caring about one particular person's safety in a world that had no guaranteed outcomes. She sat in it, she kept the rule, she did not cry. But it was, this time, the closest she had come. The day was the longest of her recent life. She went to work because staying home would have been worse. The apartment had too much silence in it, too many surfaces off which her thoughts could ricochet. She sat at her desk and translated and spoke to colleagues and responded to emails and did all the ordinary things that ordinary Tuesday demanded. And the whole time she was doing it, she was also in the quiet room behind all the professional activity, waiting. At 11:43, Daniel Petter came to her desk to ask about a client file. She looked at his ordinary face and his ordinary concern about a contract clause, and she thought, "Tonight, by the time you go home, everything you built will be gone." She thought, "You sat 20 feet from me, and I brought you coffee one Friday, and I don't know whether you understood what you were part of, or whether you were just another person who signed with that." Reading, she helped him with the contract clause. She felt nothing she hadn't decided to feel. At 2:15, Nikolai's name appeared on her phone. Not a call, a message, one line, "Nikolai, facility confirmed, everything in position. Tonight at 11. She typed back, "Understood." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed, "Come back." She stared at it. She pressed send before she could revise it into something more guarded, because she was done with guarding things that were real, and she had decided this, somewhere in the 6 o'clock dark with her hand flat against the door. His reply took 4 minutes, she counted. "Nikolai, that is my intention." She put the phone face down on her desk and looked at her computer screen and did not smile, quite, but felt something move through her that was warm and certain and entirely her own. She was home by 8. She changed clothes. She made tea. She didn't drink. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone beside her and her laptop open to nothing in particular, and she waited, which was the thing she had always done badly and was doing badly now. At 9, she called her sister, the first time in months, the conversation she had been putting off, the one that required her to say certain things out loud that she had been carrying silently for too long. "I'm leaving Marcus," she said when her sister answered. A silence, then, "Elena, finally." She almost laughed. "You knew? We all knew. We were waiting for you." A pause. "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm frightened about something, but I'm all right. I'm more all right than I've been in a long time." "What are you frightened about?" She looked at the phone on the table. At the kitchen, at the ordinary apartment that had been too small for her for years. Someone, she said. I'm frightened for someone. Her sister was quiet for a moment, who, I'll tell you later when it's resolved, Elena. Her sister's voice was careful. Is this someone? Yes, Elena said. It is. Another silence, then softly, tell me about him. And Elena sat at her kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a night that was the longest of her recent life, and told her sister about a man who had covered her hands with his and said nothing, and who had sat on the other side of a closed door in the dark and pressed his palm against the wood, and who had said, I want to know you properly, whatever that takes, and meant it in a way she had learned. After years of language to recognize, she talked for 40 minutes. Her sister listened. At the end she said, he sounds like someone who's been alone for a long time. Elena looked at the window. Yes, she said, I think that's exactly right. At 11:47, her phone rang. She had been sitting on the couch for the last hour with the phone in her hands, not looking at it, trying to read a book she had opened to the same page 11 times. She answered before the first ring completed. Elena, his voice, she closed her eyes briefly. Tell me, she said. It's done. A pause, and in the pause she heard, she was certain she heard, something she had not heard in his voice before. The very slight unevenness of a man who has just come back from somewhere difficult and is still arriving. The facility is clear. The documentation has gone to all 3 recipients. Daniel Petter was taken into custody at 10:50. The people from the facility are with the organization we briefed. They're safe. He stopped. When he continued, his voice had dropped, become something quieter and more private. They're safe, Elena. She pressed her hand flat against her chest. And you, she said, a beat. I'm standing outside your building, he said. She was already on her feet. She went down in the elevator and through the lobby and pushed open the front door of the building, and he was standing on the pavement in the cold night air, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had set something down, not diminished, not broken, but lighter in some fundamental way, as if he had been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years and had just tonight put part of it on the ground. He looked at her, she looked at him. She crossed the pavement and stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, all those hard angles, that careful architecture, the face that gave nothing away, and found it giving something away, found him looking at her with an openness that she understood was rare and costly and entirely deliberate. He had chosen to let her see it. He was choosing, right now, to let her see him. She reached up and pressed her hand against his jaw. The same gesture he had made in the doorway returned. His eyes closed briefly at the contact, that involuntary response, that tiny surrender, and she felt beneath her palm the slight unevenness of his breathing. You came back, she said. I told you I would. You did, she said. You did tell me. He opened his eyes, looked at her with that look she had no category for, and had stopped trying to categorize. He lifted his hand and covered hers where it rested against his face and held it there, both of them still on the pavement in the cold, the city moving around them with its indifferent, continuous life. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man choosing words the way she chose words, for weight, for precision, for what they actually contained. Tell me, she said. I have not. He stopped, started again. The life I have, it is not simple. It will not become simple. There are parts of it that are mine alone to carry, and I would not put them on you, and I would not ask you to pretend they don't exist. He looked at her steadily. But I have not wanted something for myself, something that had nothing to do with the operation, with the organization, with the debt I've been paying. I have not wanted something for myself in a very long time, and I want this. A pause, clean and complete. I want you, whatever that is, whatever shape it takes. I want to know what you think about at 5 in the morning, and I want to sit across a table from you and watch you take things apart with that mind of yours, and I want. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I want to be the person you call when your hands are trembling, and you will not let yourself know they are. The silence after that was enormous. Elena stood on the pavement in the cold with her hand against his face and his hand covering hers, and felt the full, unmanaged weight of it move through her, not the frightening kind of feeling, not the kind that asks you to become smaller to contain it, but the expansive kind, the kind that says, "There is room for this. There is room for all of this. You are large enough to hold it." Her eyes filled. She had kept the rule for 33 years. She let it go, not loudly, not with the performance of emotion. Just 2 tears, one from each eye, moving down her face in the cold air, and she did not wipe them away, and she did not apologize for them, and she looked at him straight through them, because she was Elena Vasquez, and she did not look away from things that were real. He made a sound low, brief, almost inaudible, that she felt more than heard. His hand moved from hers, and he pressed his thumb gently against her cheekbone, the tear gone before it reached her jaw, and the care in the gesture was so complete and so unguarded that she understood, fully and finally, that this was a man who had not touched anyone with tenderness in a very long time, and was remembering, in real time, what it felt like to want to. "I've been alone for 11 years, he said very quietly, as if telling her a fact about the weather. As if it cost nothing when she knew it cost everything. "I know," she said. "I could tell. How? Because you looked at me like you were afraid of what you were feeling." She held his gaze. "I recognized it. I've been making that face for 6 years." Something crossed his face, the full, undefended version of that hairline crack she had seen on the first night, and he exhaled slowly and looked at her with eyes that were, for this one moment on this cold pavement in this ordinary city, entirely unguarded. "What do we do with that?" he said. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the complicated shape of what he was, and the complicated shape of what she was becoming, and the distance between where they both stood and anywhere that could be called simple. "Say for certain, we start," she said. "That's all, we just start." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who does nothing by accident, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. Not her mouth, her forehead, the most tender architecture of a kiss, the kind that says, "You are safe, you are seen, you are somewhere that will hold you." She closed her eyes. She stood in the cold and let herself be held in that moment with her whole self, the woman from the ballroom, the woman from the garden, the woman who had picked up the broken glass and walked away, the woman who pressed her palm against a door in the dark, the woman who had spent 6 years becoming smaller and was, piece by piece, finding her way back to her actual size. She let it all be there at once. They walked that night. No destination, just the city, the lit streets, the cold air that asked nothing of either of them. They talked and were silent in turns, and the silence was the good kind now, the kind that doesn't need filling because it is already full. He told her one thing about the woman he had lost years ago, just one thing, her name, and Elena received it carefully and said nothing for a moment, and then said it back to him once quietly, so that it existed between them as something acknowledged rather than buried, and she felt him exhale beside her. She told him about the woman she had been before Marcus, the one with opinions that filled rooms. He listened with the complete attention she was beginning to understand, was simply how he listened, fully, without reservation, without the constant low-level performance of listening that most people substituted for the real thing. "She's still there," he said. "I know," she said. "She's been louder recently." He looked at her sidelong in the lamplight, and something moved in his expression that was almost a smile, not quite, not yet, but the clear country a smile comes from. They stopped at a bridge over the river, stood at the railing. The city lay on both sides of them. Its lights doubled in the dark water below, and the cold was sharp and clean and felt, to Elena, like the particular clarity of something beginning. "What happens now?" she said, practically, "with Marcus, with the operation, with the legal process will move on its own schedule," he said. "Marcus's exposure is contained. He'll face a financial investigation through proper channels, nothing that touches the other matter. The documentation trail that included your firm has been sanitized. Petter will face charges that have nothing to do with you." He paused. "Your name is not on anything. You made sure of that. From the beginning." She looked at the water. "You were protecting me from the start. Before you had any reason to. I had a reason, he said. She looked at him. I watched you walk out of a ballroom, he said, and I thought, that is someone worth protecting. That is the reason. It was never more complicated than that. She held his gaze for a long moment. It's about to get more complicated, she said softly. Yes, he agreed, it is. Are you afraid of that? He considered it with the honesty she had come to expect from him. No reflexive reassurance. No performance of certainty. Yes, he said. Are you terrified? She said, and he laughed. Briefly, quietly, unexpectedly, a real laugh, unplanned and unguarded. The laugh of a man who had not used that particular muscle in a long time, and found it still worked, and Alina heard it and felt it land in her chest like the first warm day after a very long winter, and she laughed too, and they stood on the bridge over the river in the cold, and laughed at the honest admission of the shared terror, and it was the most real thing she had felt in years. He walked her back to her building at 2 in the morning. They stood outside the door, and she thought about the previous night, the corridor, the closed door, the palms against wood. Come in, she said. He looked at her. Not tonight. He said, not yet. She held his gaze. Why? Because I want to do this correctly, he said. And correctly means slowly, and slowly means, he paused. Come to dinner with me, an actual dinner, no operations, no documents, no second agenda. His dark eyes held hers with that particular, devastating attention. Just you and me in a room with no reason to be there, except that we want to be. She smiled, and it was a real one, unguarded, the smile of someone who has been surprised by something good. All right, she said. Dinner, Friday, Friday. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the most ordinary gesture, the most quietly intimate gesture, and stepped back. Good night, Alina. Good night, Nikolai. She went inside. She went up in the elevator and down the corridor, and into the apartment that was about to stop being the apartment she shared with Marcus and start being simply hers. And she stood in the kitchen and looked at the ordinary room and felt it, the spaciousness of it, the possibility of it, the room it held for whatever came next. She picked up her phone. One message sent at 2:14 in the morning. Nikolai, Friday. She smiled at the screen in the quiet kitchen. She typed back, Friday. She put the phone down and stood for a moment in the still apartment, in the life that was reorganizing itself around her, in the particular silence of a story that had not ended but had, at last, genuinely begun. And somewhere in the city, a man who had not smiled in longer than he could clearly remember was sitting in the back of a black car with the ghost of a smile still on his face, looking out at the streets he had moved through all his life, finding them. For no reason he could have defended to anyone who asked. For every reason he would have given anyone who mattered looking tonight. Entirely different, one question remained. It would remain for a long time. It had nothing to do with Marcus, or the operation, or the documents, or the people who were safe tonight because of what had been built and broken and rebuilt in the space of 11 days. It had to do with a man who had said, I have not wanted something for myself in a very long time, and a woman who had said, we just start, and the specific, unresolved, exquisitely unfinished question of what it would cost them, and what it would give them to find out what they actually were to each other. Some questions are not answered. They are lived. She knew this. She was a woman made of language, and she knew better than anyone that some sentences don't end with a period. They end with an ellipsis, with the particular, deliberate, hopeful punctuation of something still unfolding, with the quiet, insistent promise of more,